August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 demonstrators took part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom at the nation's capital. The purpose of the march was to advocate for civil and economic rights for African Americans. At the march, the final speaker was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who delivered his memorable "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he called for the end of racism. And if you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemikehistory.com. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee Patreon page in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get started. During this transformative period known as the Long 60s, which spanned from late 1950 into the early 70s, America was marred by a racial divide. Most pronounced in the South, but not absent in the North. African Americans faced stark social and economic prejudice, which was institutionalized on day-to-day life through segregation and disenfranchisement and Jim Crow laws. The reality undermined the American dream for an entire portion of America's population. Amidst this grim environment, the civil rights movement rose, spearheaded by organizations like the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Activists devoted themselves to battling against racial inequality, and they illuminated the darkness of discrimination while simultaneously inspiring millions and shining a light on policy reform that was required for change. So the idea for a March on Washington wasn't new. The 1940s witnessed the March on Washington movement spearheaded by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. The pair proposed to demonstrate in response to dubious hiring practices in the defense industry during World War II. The threat of the original march in 1941 saw then President Roosevelt pass Executive Order 8802, making discriminatory hiring practices in the defense industries illegal. As a result, the original march was postponed, but the idea didn't die. Randolph again proposed a mass march in 1957, marking the 3rd anniversary of the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. A crowd of 25,000 gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, calling the federal government uphold the verdict of the trial. Fast forward to 1963. The rising tide of civil rights action was accompanied by the disturbing violence in Montgomery, Alabama. On the 100th anniversary of President Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, leading figures from the civil rights movement assembled to discuss another March on Washington as a response to the escalating confrontations in the South. Little did they know how significant this event would turn out to be. The Kennedy administration was widely believed to not have been achieving their goals that they had set during the 1960 election, with Martin Luther King characterizing the administration's race policies as tokenism. On May 24, 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy hosted a meeting of African American cultural leaders in New York to discuss race relations, but the dialogue between Kennedy and the delegates quickly drew hostile. The delegates felt that Kennedy did not fully comprehend the gravity of the nation's racial issues. The meeting became known as the Baldwin-Kennedy meeting, revealing the gap between the needs of Black Americans and the knowledge of Washington politicians. It triggered the Kennedy administration to take action in the fight for civil rights. And on June 11, 1963, President Kennedy would deliver his speech where he declared his commitment to civil rights legislation. However, the next day, civil rights activist Medgar Evers would be assassinated in Mississippi, only further heightening the nation's racial tensions. The March on Washington was organized by the Big Six group, composed of the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress for Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the National Urban League, and the Brothers of the Sleeping Car. The planning for the march began in late 1961 with A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Initially, the focus was the immense joblessness of African Americans and the need for a public works program for employment. By early 1963, the purpose of the march had expanded to rally for both jobs and freedom, thus stressing a need for a comprehensive civil rights package, protection from police brutality, and broad economic opportunities, including a national minimum wage. The planning was meticulous, and they were aware that any violence could hamper the movement. Everything from transportation to food to medical care to marshaling had to be accounted for. Buses and trains and even freedom buses for those who couldn't afford travel were chartered from across the nation. Volunteers were deployed from Washington, D.C. to guide the attendees, and safety measures were implemented, including 5,000 off-duty officers Army troops, and National Guardsmen. Hospitals were also prepared to provide medical care to the marchers. Despite President Kennedy's initial apprehension to the demonstration, leading to a chaotic situation, the leaders of the march won him over with their commitment to peaceful protest and effective coordination. While the march had different meanings to various groups, all of them aimed to shed a light on the persistent racial and economic inequalities that African Americans face. However, the harmony was not unanimous within the civil rights movement. Bayard Rustin was worried that any violence could hinder potential legislative gains and negative the public image of the movement. Kennedy initially opposed the march and feared that it might make the racial situation worse and incite violence. He would later change his stance to one of cautious support following protests from civil rights leaders and concerned over the international perception. Furthermore, many white Americans, and mostly in the South, saw the march as a direct threat to social order of racial segregation and white supremacy. Within the Black community, though, one of the most notable critiques came from the Black Power movement, and Malcolm X most referred to the event as the Farce on Washington. They argued that the march's commitment to nonviolence and integration did not change the fundamentally racist nature of American society. Malcolm viewed the march as a pacifying event co-opted by the white establishment that placated rather than challenged the status quo. Instead, he would advocate for a more confrontational approach to civil rights. On a similar note, Black nationalists critiqued the goal of integration, which stood at the heart of the march's agenda. They believed that integration meant assimilation into a racist society. Hence, they promoted separation, self-determination, and Black autonomy instead of integration and nonviolence. Looking from a gender perspective, critics also pointed out the marginalization of women in the March on Washington. Despite women playing significant roles in the movement, the representation at the event was almost non-existent. Only one woman, Daisy Bates, was allowed to speak on the official program, and her remarks lasted just a minute. The gross underrepresentation of women highlighted the patriarchal tendencies within the civil rights movement despite their progressive labels. Despite all of these criticisms, on the day of August 28, 1963, the country experienced a surge of emotion, rising from fear, apprehension of the unknown, and transformed into unity, solidarity, and renewed sense of hope. By the early mornings, the crowd started to form at the Washington Monument and growing in number until it surged into the grounds of the Lincoln Memorial. The historic gathering was approximately 250,000 people. It was estimated that 75 to 80% of the marchers were Black, and they represented women, labor organizations, and students, celebrities, and artists like gospel singer Mahalia Jackson and folk singer Bob Dylan lent their voices to the cause, amplifying the call for equality to a global audience. The speakers presented a diverse array like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Notably was John Lewis, the youngest speaker and leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He attended on critiquing the Kennedy administration's approach to civil rights legislation. However, due to the pressure of more conservative Black leaders, Lewis was required to modify his speech significantly. Initially, Lewis planned on voicing his disapproval with what he perceived as the inequalities of the Civil Rights Act. He felt that the administration had not done enough to protect African Americans and civil rights workers from violence in the Deep South. Phrases within the speech, such as, "in good conscience, I cannot wholeheartedly support the administration's civil rights bill, for it is too little, too late. I want to know which side the federal government is on," and this illustrated his discontent and forced a rewrite of his speech. Contributions from SEC activists, including James Forman, helped revise his speech while maintaining a demand for more protection for Black Southern people and civil rights workers. However, further scrutiny of the revised speech still saw it as too divisive and militant. A particular objection was the call for immediate action and the disavowal of patience. Tensions ensued on the eve of the march, with threats to withdraw from the march by the Catholic delegation. Lewis was convinced to remove the inflammatory passages from his speech. The conflict would last until the moments before the speeches were planned to start. He added a more tempered endorsement of the Kennedy administration legislation, expressing that it is true that we support the administration's Bill of Rights. We support it with great reservation, however. Despite these modifications, Lewis continued to encourage activists to get in and to stay in the streets of every city, every village, and hamlet across this nation until true freedom comes. While the day was not without some controversy, the day would end outstanding with Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He spoke last and even outlasted the news crews and schedules. Although he was allotted only 4 minutes for his speech, he delivered a climactic 16-minute speech. Dr. King would end the speech with his famous quote that states, "When it happens, I'll be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men, white men, Jews, Gentiles, Protestants, and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty that we're free at last." In the aftermath, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was a milestone that forever changed the United States. Bringing together numerous civil rights organizations, the march was a pivotal response to rapid racial segregation, discrimination, and disparity in this country. Its peaceful protests represented a significant change to these societal issues and ignited profound changes in the American legal and societal structures. Responses to the march were varied. Black nationalists suggested that reforms by the later Johnson administration would not be enough to bring about full integration into America. Kathleen Cleaver of the Black Panther Party argued that only through revolution could we bring about the necessary redistribution of wealth and power to put an end to long-standing issues of inequality and exclusion. However, most viewed the march positively and was mainly focused on Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech and the legislative accomplishments in 1964 and 1965. The mass media also highlighted this speech, and for many decades, Martin Luther King was the main figure associated with the march. The peaceful nature of the march also stood in stark contrast to the ugly violence of white supremacists against desegregation campaigns, casting a spotlight for the need of legislative action. After the march, civil rights leaders met the Kennedy administration and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House, emphasizing the need for bipartisan support for civil rights legislation. These meetings paved the way for a shift in black voter alignment, with the Democratic Party gaining substantial support over the Republican Party. The tragic assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963 created an environment that allowed the civil rights movement demands to become more central to the nation's political agenda, now led by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The March on Washington is often attributed with the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The influence of the March on Washington was not restricted to governing and politics. It became a beacon of power for peaceful protest and civil disobedience, inspiring numerous movements and demonstrations in subsequent years. The march gave the world a blueprint for collective protest and showed how unity around a shared cause could facilitate powerful change. And this signifies a shift in societal attitudes and discourse about race, although the struggle for racial equality remains ongoing. Thank you. This has been One Mic Black History. I'm your host, Country Boy. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you like to support the channel, you can do so on Buy Me Coffee, Patreon page in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.